It's about planet Earth.
What's on the next page?
Can't we live in a way that doesn't overburden the environment?
Travelers. That would be its most significant move to end more than 2 years of global isolation. The changes may come before a series of major international events set for Hong Kong starting in late October. Volkswagen wants to raise up to $9.4 billion from the IPO of iconic sports car maker Porsche. It would be Europe's largest listing in more than a decade. VW is seeking a valuation of as much as $75 billion. That's below an
But of course, it's also a transport issue. Transport for London says that it's the biggest challenge ever faced in its history, bigger than the 2012 London Olympics, bigger than the Platinum Jubilee. You've got flights suspended at Heathrow during the funeral service so that the sound overhead isn't interrupting the proceedings. And really the worry is that if people all leave Westminster at the same time, then it could mean that the transport network is overwhelmed. But this has been long in the planning, so it is a big challenge, but it hopefully can be pulled off smoothly.
Lizzie, Westminster goes back to business tomorrow, of course, with no shortage of issues to tackle.
Indeed, Liz Truss's government was brought into Number 10 and then put almost immediately on pause because of the sad passing of the Queen. But it's going to be all systems go after the funeral. Liz Truss is flying to New York for the UN General Assembly. It's also where she'll have her first formal bilateral with Joe Biden. That, of course, cancelled after it was meant to take place over the weekend. And then later in the week, we'll have the postponed BOE decision, but also a mini budget from the new Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng. And this is the moment where Truss can set out those tax cuts as pledged during her campaign. And it's been leaked. We're expecting a growth target of 2.5% GDP per year. But the question really is, will this actually boost growth? Will it add to inflation in the process? And what will be the impact on borrowing, especially given how weak the pound is at the moment?
Thank you both for joining us, Anne Edwards and Lizzie Burdon. We continue looking also at these live images from Westminster Abbey. They opened to the congregation attending the Queen's funeral, the doors about an hour and 10 minutes ago. Of course, this is one of the largest gatherings of heads of states and royalty that the UK has hosted for decades. Now, central banks around the world take center stage this week. They're forecast to deliver rate hikes adding up to more than 500 basis points combined, with the potential for a bigger tally. Now, things kick off tomorrow with the Riksbank, which is expected to accelerate tightening with a 75 basis point move. Consensus sees the Fed hiking by the same amount a day later, though some are still looking for 100 basis points. Now, we're joined by Fiona Frick, Chief Executive Officer of Unigestion. Fiona, it's a huge, huge week, of course, for the markets and for central banks. How aggressive are you expecting Jay Powell to be?
So obviously, as you said, 75 basis points to 100 basis points. We expect the Fed rate to be at 4.5 at the end of the year. There's been clear messaging from Jay Powell that he will favor getting inflation down rather than growth, and even if this means having negative growth in the next quarters. So I think the direction is clear, and the market has finally agreed that it will be the priority. If in July there was a sort of hope that it would turn faster, now in August and September, the market has understood that this will be the priority for longer.
Fiona, we're looking at the terminal Fed rate outlook. Where are you expecting it to be, and how much of a correction in stocks will happen until we get there?
We expect it to be between 4.25 and 4.5 at the end of the year. For the Fed rate, we expect the European rate to be at 2.5. So we believe that there will be some volatility, and a 10% correction is clearly possible in this context. And obviously a lot of boom and burst, and more burst and boom rather than the contrary.
Fiona, we have some great charts that our Valerie Teitel put together. If you look at the Fed, the BOE, the S&P, we also have Riksbank. Is there one central bank that could surprise us, which means that you could position yourself in the markets ahead of it to make a bit of money?
I think central banks has been quite clear in the messaging, and obviously the only one where it's more is less clear is Europe, obviously, because they have to fight inflation rate going up, but also growth decelerating at a faster pace, and Europe entering into recession potentially. So that's the one I would say that where we could have some surprise on not as being as aggressive as we would imagine. I imagine the S&P will be quite aggressive. It has already been at the beginning of a few months ago. So we could also see there another 75 basis points. Yeah. So Europe is where there is more leeway. Also Japan, we forgot about that, but Japan is in a very strange situation. Inflation is not as strong. It's not strong, but the yen has depreciated so much. So the consensus was that it would stay the same, but we could imagine also Japan at one point bringing the rate up, even if inflation is subdued.
Fiona, what would halt actually the dollar's ascent? And we have once again a great chart looking at the 5-10-year, spread, and I think the inflation expectations after we had that University of Michigan data last Friday.
I think the dollar, obviously, it's not the other currencies going down, but it's really the dollar strengthening. And I think the move of the gold is quite interesting also, because we see gold going down, and it shows that dollar has replaced gold as of now as a way to store cash.
Fiona, thanks so much. Fiona Frick there, Chief Executive Officer of Unigestion. Coming up, we continue our coverage of the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, which is due to take place later this morning. We're looking at live pictures, of course, of Westminster Abbey, both inside and outside. This is Bloomberg.
What do you think of when you think of a battery? For most, it's what we use to power devices for both work and play, and maybe even your car. Over the past few decades, they've gotten way more powerful, long-lasting, and affordable. But all of this is just a prologue to what the next batteries are going to do.
As we drive to an increasingly renewable power-driven grid, we also need to be able to store energy and release it later to cover those periods of weather intermittencies that are driving this new grid that we're in. It's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, and it's imperative that we figure out the solution here.
How we store energy on a massive scale is in many ways the central challenge of the fight to stop climate change.
Japan's critical role in the global economy is changing as the world recalibrates. After decades of stagnation, Japan's leaders are forging a more innovative and sustainable path forward to revitalize the nation. Corporate giants, policymakers, and pioneers tell us how they're doing just that. Every week on Japan Ahead, right here on Bloomberg Television.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, global leaders have gathered in London for the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II in Westminster Abbey later today. We're joined by Zaki Cooper. He's director and co-founder of Integra Group. Zaki was assistant press secretary to Her Majesty the Queen from 2009 to 2012 and led the strategic communication for the Diamond Jubilee. So, Zaki, thank you so much for joining us. Of course, this is an extremely moving day. We're looking at live pictures outside, I think, the Mall, as we also saw live pictures with all of the dignitaries arriving in Westminster Abbey. You've been working closely with the Queen and, of course, her entourage. What's been your fondest memory of her?
Well, you're right, Francine. I was privileged to work at Buckingham Palace on the Diamond Jubilee, which was the 60-year anniversary of the Queen's reign back in 2012. And I have many fond memories of going on a UK regional tour with Her Majesty and Prince Philip during that year, where they went all over the UK. And what was amazing about that were the crowds that greeted them all over the country, from all the 4 nations, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. They went deep into rural areas, villages, towns, cities. And it was really incredible to see the reaction to the Queen, who was then in her mid-80s, of course.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. And in the last 10 days, what's been your reflection on the kind of monarchy and monarch that this country has seen?
Well, I think we've all been taking stock. It's been an incredibly momentous reign of 70 years, and the Queen has been a magnificent monarch, both a matriarchal figure and a grandmother figure, in the words of Prince William, one of her grandchildren, but also, of course, our monarch for the UK and the monarch of several other countries, 15 other countries. And the amount that she's done over that time has been absolutely incredible. 21,000 public engagements, according to Buckingham Palace, and all the different events, the garden parties, the investitures where people have honours, the credentials, when new ambassadors are sworn in, the state visits. She's done so much over that 70 years.
But how much of this was really down also to Her Majesty's personality, to her sense of duty, and how will her son, King Charles, be different?
Well, I think like in any job, you have the role, but people bring their personality into it. And the Queen was only 25 when she became Queen back in 1925. Of course, her first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, then in his late 70s. And it must have been quite intimidating almost for the young Queen Elizabeth. But she obviously got used to the role very quickly and took her duty very, very seriously, and then embarked on this incredible reign and really knew her strengths and played to her strengths, and really her sense of dedication and service sort of shone throughout her reign. And I think, you know, King Charles will reign in his own way, and I think he's already made a strong start in the first 10 days of his reign.
What will be his most difficult challenge? Of course, he's facing this balancing act as Commonwealth head. I guess as the role of a hereditary monarch, it may be questioned for the Commonwealth.
Well, we live in such a changing world. He comes to the throne, obviously, in a very different era to when his mother came to the throne. There's been huge economic, technological and social change. Of course, Britain has had Brexit, we've had COVID. We're also, like the rest of the world, grappling with the effects of the Ukraine-Russia war. So there is so much going on. And the Commonwealth itself is something that was dear to the Queen's heart and will obviously be something the King wants to focus on and try and hold that together. That association of 56 nation states, which was so important, obviously, to the Queen.
Zach, we're looking at these live pictures together. Really incredible to see so many dignitaries from around the world. We're expecting the heads of state to arrive shortly. When you look at, I guess, some of the challenges that we were talking about, there has been also an adaptation of how the royal household communicates, right, with citizens through social media. Talk to us about how that's changed over the years.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the royal household has embraced social media over the last 15 or 20 years. In fact, I think the palace launched its website in 1997, which the Queen launched, and then in the next decade started to adopt social media. So it started Flickr and Facebook and YouTube accounts, etc. And that's given the palace the opportunity to communicate directly with the global public. So, of course, to work with the mainstream media, and that's really important, but to communicate directly with this massive global public, which is particularly important given the Queen and now the King's role as head of the Commonwealth, which has 56 countries and has a very young population as well. And obviously, young people are using this sort of social media. So that's a really important new phenomenon.
Zaki, what do you think King Charles will focus on? So he has been, of course, one of the biggest champions on sustainability and green. Will he change as king? And how much will he focus also on the Union, including Scotland?
Well, I think he's already indicated in his opening address that he realises life will change and his role will be different. And I suspect that some of the campaigning work he did as Prince of Wales, where he had a significant impact on things like youth unemployment and the green agenda, as you say. Some of that will have to slow down or stop. And really, it will be getting used to the new role. He's been Prince of Wales for over 50 years. Being monarch, head of state is different. He's acknowledged that. And he'll have to take on the duties that his mother had. And that will obviously be a period of adjustment for him as well.
Do you think the royal household will also change? I know there has been talk of him really being extremely careful in who's in the firm, who works for the firm, and how much money gets out.
That remains to be seen. I think there have been signals, as you say, from the new king that he wants a more slimmed-down monarchy, and that seems to be the way public opinion has shifted. So I would expect movement in that direction. I don't think it will happen overnight. It will be gradual and subtle, as things are with the royal family. But yes, I would expect that to be the general direction of travel over the coming years.
We know, although not with much certainty, because all of these conversations are so private, that the Queen was, not only reassuring to prime ministers and heads of state, but was seen as a motherly figure with words of advice. How will King Charles be different or similar in that?
Yeah, well, we know that, as you say, prime ministers value their weekly meeting with the monarch. It's an opportunity for them to unload. It's one of the only meetings they go to where there's no public record taken, and they can be pretty confident that nothing will leak. And I think the 15 prime ministers during the Queen's reign really valued that. And I think I see no different with King Charles. I think the King, as Prince of Wales, had a number of meetings with prime ministers and senior politicians, so he's well accustomed to operating in that type of environment.
Zaki, thanks so much for joining us. Zaki Cooper, there, director and co-founder of Integra Group, former assistant press secretary to Her Majesty the Queen. Now, coming up, we continue our coverage of the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, which is due to take place later this morning. This is Bloomberg.
A digital-first approach to the future of work is where the industry and all companies will be heading.
Could the future of work not be at home or in the office, but in the metaverse instead?
There's that word, metaverse.
Doing well. How are you doing?
When I think about the metaverse, I think about immersive experiences that have a sense of active presence.
Wow, look at this. This is me. The metaverse is projected to become over $1 trillion market by the end of this decade. And whether you know it or not, you'll probably be working there in the future.
We're moving into a world where we're going to be interacting with computers with our bodies.
This is definitely trippy.
I think the adoption curve is going to be slow.
It's weird.
Like a weird floaty thing right now.
Oh, look at you. You have no legs.
It's kind of a fun world, and we're just at the very beginning of a very long journey.
The difference between political gossip and policy intelligence. Bloomberg Government provides our clients with expert reporting, analysis, and public affairs tools that give you the edge in reaching policymakers on the Hill. When you're in the business of influence in Washington, information and connections are the currencies on which you rely. For knowledge you can act upon, the difference is Bloomberg Government.
We have to be able to give our customers vehicles, that are their primary vehicles that are EVs, and to be able to do that, we need to have range and infrastructure, and we need to remove the pain points. And so that's what we're doing.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's look at the markets because it is a very big week when it comes to central bank policy. Of course, today activity muted by a holiday in Japan, but also the UK observing a day of mourning for Queen Elizabeth II. No trading in cash treasuries during the Asian and European sessions. Now we have had quite a lot of weakness overall in markets. That really reflects expectations of an outsized interest rate hike from the Federal Reserve on Wednesday. In general, there are worries that its aggressive tightening to quell inflation will trigger a recession. Investors also facing potential volatility from policymakers this week by the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and a host of other central banks. The other thing we're watching out for, and I know it is there on the screen, is the British pound sinking to its weakest level against the dollar since 1985 on Friday. Today, of course, a little bit subdued because of what we're seeing with the mourning of the Queen, yen remaining under pressure. Now, we're looking at live images, of course, of Westminster Abbey. The global leaders and dignitaries from U.S. President Joe Biden to the Japanese emperor.
There is an epic saying in Italy when it comes to family generations that the first generation creates, the second generation expands, and the third generation destroys. And that's almost what happened in the Gucci story.
So hate and love together.
Now I would have a much more experience about those who says I love you and then betray you.
The Gucci family was the strength, but also the weakness of the label.
The situation became dire with Gucci's finances. They were not able to pay salaries. They were not able to pay suppliers. Gucci's really teetering on the brink at this stage.
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
We have to get interest rates higher and bring inflation back to our target.
33 million people have been affected by this flooding in the Amazon.
Disruption is the whole point of a strike.
With unmatched reach and resources from more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, your global business authority.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
So global dignitaries from President Biden to Japan's Emperor Naruhito descend on London to join mourners for the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Powell Plus, the Fed headlines, the flood of central bank decision this week as global policymakers scramble to pay soaring prices. The BOE, Bank of Indonesia, and BOJ also decide. And upping the ante, President Biden says the U.S. would defend Taiwan from an unprecedented attack by China, risking more tensions with Beijing. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to your Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Francine. Volkswagen is looking to raise as much as $9.4 billion from the IPO of its iconic Porsche brand. The German car giant says it's seeking a valuation of $70 to $75 billion in what's set to be Europe's largest listing in more than a decade. The offer period will start on Tuesday, with trading planned to begin on September the 29th. Hong Kong is reportedly set to scrap hotel quarantine rules for inbound travellers. According to the Oriental Daily, the announcement could come as soon as this week, with arrivals required to undergo 7 days of self-monitoring at home instead of hotel quarantine. Separately, Sing Tao reports that those arriving may no longer be forced to show a negative PCR test. UBS is reportedly hiring content reviewers to check that its research published in Chinese is free of any sensitivities. The Financial Times says reviewers will check that the language, tone and content is appropriate and adheres to regulatory and internal guidelines. UBS has so far hired one reviewer in Hong Kong and is recruiting more in Singapore. That's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Thank you so much, Laura. Now, the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II is due to begin soon. Her Majesty's coffin will then be transferred to a hearse and travel by road to Windsor Castle, where she will be laid to rest with her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. Well, for more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Anna Edwards in central London, Lizzie Burden outside Westminster Hall, where the Queen was lying in state. So, Anna, what are we expecting today?
Good to speak to you again, Francine. We're expecting in an hour and a half time the state funeral to begin, but in the run-up to that and the build-up to that, we've been witnessing the early arrivals. We'll soon see the global leaders who descended on London to attend the Queen's funeral. We will soon see them arrive at Westminster Abbey. So once everybody is seated, a procession will start from Westminster Hall, the 900-year-old hall where the Queen has been lying in state since last week. And hundreds of thousands of British mourners and indeed tourists have been queuing for hours and miles to pay their respects to the Queen in Westminster Hall. We will see them move from Westminster Hall in a procession that will be followed by senior members of the royal family, including King Charles III, his children and grandchildren, so some of his grandchildren at least. So that is going to be something that we'll certainly be watching for. Once the service starts, we'll see representatives of various religious groups in attendance, various Christian denominations as well. There'll be elements of the traditional and elements of the modern, as we've come to know from Queen Elizabeth during her reign.
Lizzie, this is also a major logistical challenge for city authorities. So how is London preparing for this event?
Indeed, because hundreds of thousands of people already queued to witness the lying in state of Queen Elizabeth II at Westminster Hall. That in itself was a logistical challenge, but 2 million are now expected to descend on the capital to try and catch a glimpse of this moment of history. Millions more will watch on television, and Westminster Abbey holds 2,000 people, and they will include those foreign dignitaries, heads of state from all around the world. So it really is the biggest security challenge in terms of protection that the Metropolitan Police has faced. It's also big for transport. Transport for London says it's its biggest challenge. It's bigger than the 2012 Olympics, bigger than the Platinum Jubilee. You've had road closures all around central London, and Heathrow, of course, has also suspended flights during the time of the funeral service so as not to have the sound overhead during the service. But the worry is that if everybody leaves the capital at exactly the same moment after the funeral, it could overwhelm the network.
Lizzie, Westminster, of course, also goes back to business tomorrow, and there's many issues to tackle.
Yes, Liz Truss entered number 10 Downing Street, managed to get her energy bailout through, but then, of course, her government was suspended because of the sad news of the Queen's passing. But business will begin again after the funeral. Truss is going to fly to New York for the UN General Assembly, where she's going to meet Joe Biden, the US President, for the first formal bilateral meeting. She was meant to meet him over the weekend, but that, of course, has been postponed. She's also set to make a speech calling on Western leaders to remain supportive of the war efforts in Ukraine. But then later in the week, when she comes back, we'll also have a mini budget from the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, expected to be the moment where when all these tax cut pledges made through the campaign become reality. And also, as leaks suggest, that he's set a growth target of 2.5% GDP growth per year. But really the question is, how much will all of this add to borrowing? How much will it add to inflation, especially when the backdrop is such a weak pound?
Lizzie, thanks so much. Bloomberg's Lizzie Borden joining us. Anna Edwards stays with us. You can, of course, watch special coverage of the funeral right here on Bloomberg TV beginning at 11 a.m. UK time. That's 6 a.m. in New York or 6 p.m. if you're in Hong Kong. Now, we're also joined by Robert Hazel. He's Professor of Government and Constitution at University College London. In 2006, Robert was awarded CB for his services to constitutional reform. Professor, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us. As we reflect, of course, on a very fruitful but not without controversial reign of Queen Elizabeth II, what will you look forward to in the next 10 days?
Well, it has been the longest reign in British history. She reigned for over 70 years. She's been queen for all of my adult lifetime. I was 4 when she came to the throne in 1952. I'm exactly the same age as her son, now King Charles. And for almost everyone in Britain, she has been our queen for all our lifetimes. And indeed for people around the world, because she was queen not just of the United Kingdom, but of 14 other countries around the world. She was queen of Australia, of Canada, of New Zealand, of Jamaica, of countries in the Pacific like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu. And so that is why this immense state funeral is a global event. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why leaders from all around the world have come to pay their respects to the late Queen.
Of her reign and what she has meant, what the monarchy means for what she has meant to the British people and beyond. I wonder where the monarchy goes from here, though, in the sense of looking at some of the polling data. There is a great deal of affection for the monarchy still. 60% or so of Britons say that they want to keep the monarchy, keep this form of government that we have in place, constitutional democracy. But at the same time, if you look at the age profile of the way people answer those questions, it's very different. There's a lot more enthusiasm amongst older people than there is amongst the young. How do you think that plays out?
You're right. Support for the monarchy has been consistently very high, going back 30, 40 years. Ever since the beginning of opinion polling on this, the monarchy has commanded levels of support of 60 to 80%. And you're also right that it does vary between the generations in the population. And we wait to see. We haven't yet had any opinion polls so early in the reign of the new King Charles. And I genuinely don't know whether this outburst of respect and affection for the Queen might lead to a boost in support for the monarchy, or whether there will be anxiety, concerns over whether King Charles can follow in her very, very big footsteps, and whether that might in time lead to a decline in support. But one of the things about monarchy is that you don't just have a monarch, you have the whole of the royal family. And different generations can appeal to different age groups in the population. So I think Prince William and Kate, for example, will be great assets for the royal family, and they may help to boost younger people.
Yep. So when you look at the very difficult balancing act for King Charles, how will he act as Commonwealth head?
He is head of the Commonwealth. That was agreed at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting 4 years ago now in Windsor in 2018. I think early in his reign, he will want to pay visits to the main Commonwealth countries where he is now their new head of state. I think he's already expressed a wish to go to Australia. I'm sure he'll want to go early on to Canada and to some of the other of the bigger realms where he's the new king. And like his mother, I'm sure he will be a very conscientious attender every 2 years at the meetings of the Commonwealth Heads of Government. And I have no doubt we'll hear references to the Commonwealth. Indeed, at the service, the funeral service today, the Commonwealth Secretary General will be giving one of the addresses.
Yes, indeed, that happens in not very long then, in an hour and 20 minutes or so. What do we think the size of the royal family will look like from here, Professor? Is that something that we're going to see addressed, do you think, in the fairly short term, or does that wait until we haven't had a date for coronation yet, of course?
My guess is the coronation will be sometime in the next 6 to 9 months, so it'll be next spring or next summer. And the king has expressed in the partial wish to slim down the size of the royal family. It currently has 12 working members, but of those 12, half of them are people aged in their 70s and 80s. So just in the next few years, it's likely to slim down naturally as those people retire. If we have a working royal family of only half a dozen people or so, they will be able to carry out a smaller number of royal duties. And I think they may need to manage public expectations quite carefully, because there is huge demand within the UK for royal visits. The royal family last year conducted between 2,000 and 3,000 visits, and there's demand around the world as well.
Thank you so much, Robert Hazel, there, Professor of Government and the Constitution at University College London. And Edwards, of course, stays with us. The first bells have begun to toll for the late Queen outside Westminster Abbey. We understand that they will actually toll once every minute in the run-up to the funeral to mark every year of the 96-year-old monarch's life. Coming up, leaders from around the world are in London for the funeral this morning. We'll have plenty more on that. This is Bloomberg.
hardest thing in life, I've often said, is to be happy, but you're seeming like a very happy person.
It's like nature. Nothing ever stops. So you could be super happy in 1 minute and then something happens. So it's just living. It's the joy of life.
For any young woman that's watching this, wants to be the next Diane von Furstenberg, what would you recommend?
I think the most important thing in life is the relationship you have with yourself. Once you have a good relationship with yourself, any other relationship is a plus and not a must. And the second advice is to be as true to yourself as you possibly can. And you have to accept and own things you may not like, but the more you could be you, the happier you will be.
Power, policy, politics. From the White House to the Hill, Bloomberg covers the leaders in legislation.
That was really a tectonic shift for this White House.
The theory of this bill, as I understand it, is there'll be a multiplier effect. How did Democrats mobilize specifically younger voters?
Bringing you the political news you need to know.
The president has made it very clear that this is a significant focus.
For the intersection of Wall Street and Washington, nobody covers politics like Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, it's a very momentous day here in the UK. Global leaders have flocked to the capital for the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. We've been watching them arrive throughout the morning with thousands of mourners who have come to pay their respects to the UK's longest reigning monarch. Now, we're joined by Bloomberg opinion columnist Therese Raphael. Anna Edwards is also still with us. Therese, you wrote of this pretty incredible experience, right? As an American in the UK at the end of the Elizabethan era, how is the Queen viewed in America and outside of the UK?
Look, I think this is very much a global happening, what we're seeing in Britain, and Americans are as transfixed as people around the world. I mean, I think America's relationship to the monarchy is obviously very different from what we see inside the UK. There are people that follow extremely closely the ins and outs, the celebrations, the pomp and the circumstance, and there's a lot of excitement around that. And I think there's also, outside of that, a huge respect for her personally. We don't have a head of state that sits above politics in the same way that the Queen did and King Charles will. Our head of state is elected. He is in the bear pit of politics. He is a member of a political party. So I think that's something that Americans look at with a mixture of sort of curiosity and admiration. Now, of course, there are some that just find it very curious that you have this head of state, this entire institution that is formed out of inherited wealth and position. And, I think that sits a little oddly with some people, but I would say that there's huge fascination and many will be watching very closely.
Therese, just as you were speaking, we were just looking at live pictures. We continue to look at live pictures of some of the preparations, the various units getting into position as is required. I think we just saw the Yeomen of the Guard, the oldest, one of the oldest of the regiments in their traditional Tudor costume. Much has been made of the queue, which we talked about. The Queen then, thinking about how she is perceived abroad and the impact that she had abroad, she projected soft power, has been said by many. How do you think America and the rest of the world, Therese, perceives that kind of soft power?
Yeah, I think, it's been a long time since Britain had an empire, since it was a large global power, but the monarchy has a way of reaching into all the corners of the world. Everyone who was anyone met the Queen, wanted to meet the Queen. The ceremonials around weddings, funerals, jubilees were watched around the world, and it has been an enormous amplifier of power, of soft power for Britain. And it will be very interesting to see how and in what ways, and probably small ways, that may change as we exit the Elizabethan era and go into the era of the reign of King Charles. But there's, no question that Britain's place in the world was, much amplified, much stronger because of her presence. Both the presence of the monarchy, but her personally, having been there for 7 decades, having witnessed so much history. Most of the big events of the second half of the 20th century could be viewed through the lens of her reign, and she interacted in various ways with different political leaders. So, I think everyone is marking the end of an era of history, as well as saying goodbye to just a remarkable human being.
Therese, and again, we're reminded, of course, about the Queen's passing and her legacy. We know that she probably, without openly saying so, did everything she could to keep the Union together. Does the Union now face a more uncertain future under King Charles?
I think whenever you have a period of, of a stable presence like that, who is so universally admired and respected, and there's a change, there is uncertainty. So I think Charles has had a very long time to observe his mother, to be an understudy for the role that he's taken on. I think he's prepared for this in many ways, but he's not Queen Elizabeth II, and clearly there are going to be some changes. I think we've seen a remarkable outpouring of support from her in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales, and we saw, his very sort of moving, speech in front of, in Wales, where he spoke in Welsh, and he is the Prince of Wales, of course, even though he's in some ways more associated with Scotland because they spent so much time there. But, I think the forces that are challenging the Union are sort of outside the monarchy. They're to do with Brexit. They're to do with Scottish, independence. And while the monarchy can be a glue, it will take more than that to keep that bond strong, and that will be down to the new government as well.
Therese, thank you so much. Our Bloomberg opinion columnist, Therese Raphael. Anna Edwards, of course, stays with us as we look at these very, moving images coming from all parts of London. Coming up, the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, set to begin in just over an hour, a deeply historic day for the UK, and an end to the 10-day mourning period for its longest reigning monarch. We'll continue watching that next. This is Bloomberg.
do you think of when you think of a battery? For most, it's what we use to power devices for both work and play, and maybe even your car. Over the past